What does a prisoner of war camp look like in our imagination? Barbed wire, guard towers, armed sentries, and a crowd of men in identical uniforms moving in silence across an open yard. It is a picture about confinement, about waiting, about the grey coda of war. It seems as if there is nothing more to say. On the barbed wire, alongside warning signs, you might also see a few camp notices posted, work assignments, or a film screening scheduled for next week. From the camp loudspeakers at fixed hours, you hear not only internal announcements, but news from the outside world. And when prisoners return from a day of labour, what they receive may not be money, but small scrip or vouchers they can spend at the camp canteen to trade for a bar of soap or a few cigarettes. These details are easy to miss at first. Yet they point to a reality that goes beyond what many people imagine. In some Allied-run POW camps, the object of management was not only the prisoners' bodies. A silent project was underway, day after day, as the sun rose and set. Its target was information, ideas, even the prisoners' imagination of the future. The war had not ended, but inside these fenced spaces, a profound remaking had already begun. It did not proceed through slogans or brute force, but through a precise and durable system of everyday life. So how did it start? Where does the first crack appear in a wall built from belief and experience? The answer may be simpler and more subtle than you expect. Change often begins with the smallest details. For many German soldiers newly marched into Allied POW camps, especially younger zealots shaped by Nazi ideology, the first fracture in their mental armor did not come from fiery anti-Nazi speeches. It came from something they did not anticipate: the dullness of order. They arrived braced for cruelty, degrading forced labor, or chaotic living conditions. That was what they had been taught to expect from the enemy, and it was the trial they had prepared for to prove their faith. Yet in many British and American camps operating under the framework of the Geneva Convention, what greeted them was a calm, even stiffly bureaucratic regimen. At dawn, a fixed bugle call or whistle sounded. Not a sudden raid, but wake up. Then roll call, names checked, numbers counted. Breakfast followed. The food might be plain, but the portions and timing were broadly consistent. After that, as scheduled, some men were marched out in work details, others stayed in camp to handle maintenance. Labor was logged, hours were defined: lunch, rest, more work, return to camp, supper, lights out. Day after day, week after week. Medical care was a critical link in the chain. Sick prisoners were sent to the camp infirmary and received basic treatment. Representatives of the International Committee of the Red Cross visited regularly, inspecting barracks, kitchens, and medical facilities. Parcels from family members or the Red Cross after inspection were delivered to prisoners. Inside might be a book, biscuits, a few pieces of chocolate, or, most prized of all, cigarettes. Those goods helped create a lively barter economy inside the camp. But they also produced a different kind of stability. Contact with the outside world, filtered though it was, had not been entirely severed. Even entertainment and religious needs were folded into the system. Some camps organized football matches, handicraft competitions, or made instruments available. Requests for worship services, so long as they did not involve political agitation, were typically granted in designated spaces. For many prisoners, all of this was a cognitive shock. Their hostility landed like a punch thrown into a soft pad, with no solid surface to strike. Extreme ideology feeds on unbroken crisis, on the feeling of external oppression and internal deprivation. Here, the most basic threats to survival, hunger, arbitrary execution, total isolation, were systematically reduced or pushed back by the camp's routines. One former prisoner, recalling those days years later, used a plain but piercing image. Like a constant high fever that suddenly begins to subside slowly. The first thing you feel is not clarity, it is exhaustion, an exhaustion that comes from the bones, and then quiet. That predictability began to work on the mind. When a person no longer has to fear for basic survival every moment, psychological bandwidth is released. Thoughts that had been pressed down by battlefield noise, extreme propaganda, and raw pressure can begin to surface. At night, lying on a relatively clean bunk, a prisoner might for the first time remember a detail from home that has nothing to do with war. The smell of a spice in his mother's kitchen, or a river he used to visit with friends before the war. He might start calculating how long the war has lasted and sense a new, purely personal bewilderment. When this is over, what will I have left? What can I do? This was not repentance, and it was nowhere near conversion. It was simply the first strip of wet sand revealed as fanaticism receded. The institutional daily routine did not attack their beliefs head-on, but it quietly pulled away some of the psychological fuel that sustained those beliefs. Constant crisis, absolute scarcity. It offered no answers, but it created a calmer mental state in which thinking could occur. That became the platform for everything more complex that followed. On that platform, the prisoners were no longer only captives struggling to survive. They began to become listeners capable of receiving, individuals capable of doubt. As the mechanical hum of daily life turned into background noise, another sound began to arrive, clear and impossible to ignore. It came from new battle reports posted on the camp bulletin board, from the news broadcasts that sounded at the same hour each day, from the light that would soon be thrown onto a barrack wall. When routine made space in the mind, another force moved in to fill it. That force was information. The Allied administrators of POW camps, especially those influenced by wartime psychological warfare thinking, understood something plainly. It was not enough to imprison bodies. They had to compete for the right to define reality. And so, within the barbed wire, a quiet information campaign began. There was no smoke, but the objectives were just as deliberate. It started with text. In camp libraries, alongside novels and poetry, shelves gradually filled with vetted books in history, geography, and social science. On bulletin boards, alongside work details and discipline notices, a new category of material appeared: Allied situation reports. The style was strategic. These notices rarely relied on emotional abuse or hollow slogans. They focused on arrows moving across maps, the names of captured cities, figures for equipment and personnel losses on the German side. Those numbers were sometimes simplified, and selection was inevitable. But the calm, even dry presentation of facts could seep in more deeply than furious condemnation. For younger prisoners accustomed to passionate speeches and simple chants, an information stream grounded in data, even partly curated, felt unfamiliar and therefore harder to dismiss outright. Then there was sound. At fixed times each day, loudspeakers across the camp carried news programs assembled with care. Alongside Allied frontline updates, they sometimes included summaries from neutral broadcasters in Switzerland or Sweden. Occasionally, they quoted fragments from German domestic broadcasts describing shortages and the destruction from air raids, content that German propaganda tended to soften. At first, the prisoners listened with mockery and suspicion. But day after day, when major offensives predicted by the broadcasts actually occurred, when the lines on maps moved steadily closer to German territory, the wall of disbelief began to show hairline cracks. Consistency, even a filtered consistency, can accumulate into pressure. Yet the medium with the greatest tearing power was image. According to surviving records and some eyewitness accounts around late 1944 through 1945, some of the more active camps began organizing film screenings. These were not entertainment films, but newsreels and documentaries. The most explosive material, without question, was footage of Allied forces discovering and liberating Nazi concentration camps in the West and East. Imagine the scene: a barracks room or warehouse turned into a makeshift theater. The lights go out. A 16mm projector chatters. A beam of light hits a white wall or a simple screen. At first there may be images of Allied troops advancing. Then the footage changes. Piles of corpses, emaciated beyond human shape, pushed into a trench by bulldozers. Survivors with hollow, fixed eyes staring through the screen at the audience. Rough wooden huts, a rusted gas chamber door, the remains of crematoria. The narrator might speak English, but the images themselves moved beyond language. They showed a kind of destruction outside the ordinary logic of war, a pure vision of annihilation and dehumanization. Titles and narration repeatedly named places such as Buchenwald, Dachau and Bergen-Belsen, binding them to words like Nazis, SS and Final Solution. Then the lights come back on. The room holds a long, almost suffocating silence. No one stands, no one speaks. The air is thick with shock, disbelief, shame, anger, emotions that resist easy naming. That silence carried more weight than any shouting match. It meant that something deep in the structure of belief had been hit by a direct visual challenge. The silence did not last. In the days that followed, intense, restrained arguments erupted in corners of the camp. Voices rose and fell, charged with emotion. "It's fake! It's propaganda! A Hollywood trick!" Hardliners usually struck first, their tone hard, though careful listeners could hear an unsteady edge. "Those places, I have heard of them, in the East. There were special camps." A hesitant voice might murmur, "Even if it's real, that's the SS and Gestapo. It has nothing to do with us in the Wehrmacht. We fought honorably at the front." This too was common, a desperate attempt to cut ties and draw a boundary. But then, a quieter, more lethal question could appear, sometimes from people who had been silent until then. Did we really know nothing at all? The neighbors who were taken away, the Jews who disappeared, the talk of resettlement in the East. Did we never suspect? The arguments rarely produced consensus. Camp administrators typically did not intervene directly. They simply kept supplying more ammunition, more newspaper specials printed with photographs and testimony, more briefings on the progress of war crimes trials. The strategy was not to persuade on the spot, but to keep supplying informational pressure points that could not be easily erased, letting the debate ferment within the prisoner's own community and continue. The key is that this internal debate itself was an enormous change. It broke the inner sameness of the we collective. The prisoners were no longer only German soldiers sharing the identity of captives. They began to split into believers, doubters, boundary drawers, and the lost. Information, especially visual evidence that could not be argued away, was like a cold chisel driven into a sealed inner world, forcing open a hole through which many could glimpse a disturbing truth on the other side of the war. Consensus cracked, and the cracking of consensus was the first sharp sound of an old group structure beginning to loosen. Once people began questioning each other, what held them together was no longer only comradeship or shared fate. Conflicting ideas and the pressure to take sides joined the mix. A new, more complicated web of camp relationships began to form in arguments, whispers, and silence. When a fortress of belief shows cracks, the old social structures that maintained those beliefs begin to wobble and erode as well. Inside the POW camp, a special little universe, a set of rules for survival, unlike anything on the battlefield, slowly emerged. It challenged and reshaped relationships, and each person's position within the group, without ever announcing itself. In the German military, especially at its peak, order was vertical, pyramidal, unquestioned. Authority came from rank, appointment, and abstract loyalty granted by the Führer. A person's value was tightly bound to that hierarchy. Inside the barbed wire, reality prepared a slow pressure test for that system. The most visible impact fell on officers, especially those who lacked personal charisma or practical competence and relied on rank alone to sustain authority. At the front, their orders carried life and death. Obedience was instinct and often necessary for survival. In camp, the scope of command was strictly limited. They could not direct operations. They could not decide camp administration, which belonged to guards and camp authorities. Even their influence over enlisted prisoners declined. Their former presence, repeated through roll calls, work details, and meal lines, slowly hollowed out. A former Wehrmacht lieutenant later recalled bitterly in an interview, "Sometimes I spoke, and they would still snap to attention, but look at their eyes. The front was gone from them. They were thinking about their own things, or whether there would be jam at dinner." In contrast, people with practical skills or special resources rose quietly in status. Prisoners who could repair barracks fixtures, mend clothing, or handle basic medical tasks became valued. English ability became a major form of capital. Those who could communicate effectively with guards or administrators often secured small conveniences for their barracks or conveyed grievances more accurately. They naturally became new hubs of connection. Even those who could organize a football match, find extra books for the barracks, or coordinate shared hygiene routines gained influence. This influence did not come from issuing orders. It came from meeting needs and enabling exchange. In many camps, with the permission and sometimes encouragement of the authorities, a self-organized representative system formed. Through nomination or election, prisoners selected spokesmen or barracks representatives. These men negotiated daily matters with administrators, conveyed rules, distributed supplies, and mediated minor disputes. Notably, the winners were often not the highest-ranking officers, but figures seen as fairer, more patient, better at communication, or simply more trusted by the majority. The process itself was a vivid lesson in collective decision-making and a public vote against the old authority system. For the most rigid Nazi true believers, this shift often produced the deepest anxiety. Their faith fit poorly with the camp's increasingly complex reality. They tried to keep small circles pure, holding secret meetings, preaching final victory and steadfast belief. But those words sounded thin against stable rations, concrete work assignments, and increasingly credible news from home. The harder they clung, the more they were sometimes pushed to the margins, seen as troublemakers or impractical dreamers. In some camps, hardliners tried to stop others from reading Allied newspapers or denounced prisoner representatives as traitors. Yet they found it harder and harder to mobilize broad support. A typical internal conflict might center on assigning labor tasks. A former officer might try to use old authority to steer lighter work to his favorites, but the prisoner representative responsible, perhaps only a former corporal, would refuse based on the rotation list set by the authorities, and receive backing from ordinary prisoners who wanted fair turns. The dispute would be resolved not by rank, but by rules and the majority's will. Or consider the dining hall, where a debate over a battlefield report might heat up. An ordinary soldier skilled at analysis, citing specific production figures from Allied newspapers, perhaps comparing tank output, might gain the upper hand against a stubborn NCO who could only repeat slogans. The nods or silence of listeners became a new kind of public verdict. These small frictions and power struggles, repeated day after day, demonstrated a new reality. The old hierarchy was failing, and new rules grounded in competence, cooperation, and practical needs were forming. Your value, the respect you received, depended less and less on what rank you once held, and more on what you could provide to this temporary community. That social restructuring reinforced the loosening of ideas. When you discover that a superior who lectures endlessly about National Socialist ideals cannot even organize a decent card game in camp, while a quiet engineer who can fix a leaking pipe becomes someone everyone relies on, some old assumptions about authority and worth inevitably begin to soften. This reconstruction of roles had to land on the hardest foundation of all, labor. As rank yielded to usefulness, the core measure of a person shifted from who you were to what you could do. And what you could do, and how well you did it, would be measured most directly outside the wire, in fields and workshops. Ideas evolved through argument, relationships reformed through adaptation. But to turn that invisible change into a new sense of self required something more concrete, something repeated day after day. In the POW camp, that anchor was labor. Under the Geneva framework, it was an obligation and a management tool, but it also became a furnace that reshaped identity and values. Before dawn, the camp stirred awake. Unlike the frontline tension of waiting for combat, this was an orderly mobilization for a specific productive purpose. Work details assembled. Under guard, the prisoners walked or rode trucks to farms, forests, canneries, or road crews scattered around the camp. Here, at least in their minds, they shed the last veneer of German soldier and became numbered laborers. Agricultural work was most common. In broad fields in England or the American Midwest, prisoners sowed, weeded, harvested, and picked fruit. Standards became sharply concrete and worldly. Were you on time? Did you work hard? Were the apples you picked unbruised? Were the sheaves of wheat tied neatly and to spec? Overseers, whether soldiers or civilian employees, cared less about political views or battlefield record than about output and safety compliance. The relationship was purely instrumental. stripping ideology away and reducing human interaction to manager and worker. To motivate labor and improve administration, many camps established a simple internal economic system. Prisoners earned pay for work, usually not cash, but tokens, vouchers, or points circulating inside the camp. This money could be spent at the camp canteen to buy extra items beyond standard rations, a real bar of soap, a pack of cigarettes, a bottle of beer, writing paper, a pencil, or a piece of chocolate. The amount depended on the type of work, hours, and performance. This miniature economy had deep effects. First, it introduced the market logic of pay for labor. What you received began to tie directly to what you did here and now, not to the rank you once held or the fantasies you might still cling to. A hard-working prisoner with technical skill might save substantial vouchers, improving his own life and sometimes lending or trading to others, gaining social influence grounded in economic capacity. Second, it created a social scene full of daily life and largely stripped of politics. Outside the canteen or inside barracks, the talk was less about the front or ideology, more about which brand of cigarettes burned longer, how to trade saved sugar coupons for cheese, or which work detail might be assigned next week to a better beet farm. A subtler change, perhaps even more important, came from limited, informal contact with local civilians at work sites. Language barriers and guards were always present, but day after day in close proximity, moments occurred that did not fit the enemy captive script. A prisoner who worked efficiently might receive a simple nod from a farmer. Another who fixed a jammed tractor might find the farmer's wife silently offering a cup of milk or an apple. These moments were small and cautious, but they carried a different signal: recognition as a useful person. In later memories, prisoners described this labor experience as complex and conflicted. Some felt humiliation, believing servants' work damaged military dignity. But many expressed something else. A former artillery corporal wrote decades later, "On the battlefield, my trade was calculating trajectories and destroying targets. Everything was about damage and taking away. But on the farm, when I watched potato sprouts I had tended grow taller each day, or when I tied golden wheat into stacks, the feeling was strange. You are participating in creation. You are producing something. It may be tiny, it may not belong to you. But it makes you feel that beyond being a soldier, you might be something else." Another prisoner who worked machining parts in a factory recalled, "The foreman cared whether your pieces met tolerance. He did not ask where you came from or what you believed. He cared whether your hands were steady and your eyes were precise. When you finished a batch that passed inspection, the satisfaction was real. It was not like receiving an Iron Cross, an honor someone else grants you. This satisfaction was something you made with your own hands." Labor, in this way, quietly rewrote the meaning of value and contribution. It did not explicitly deny their past, but it offered a clear, practical template aimed at the future. You could be a producer, a builder, someone who earns pay and limited recognition through skill and effort. This identity differed from being a warrior sacrificing for the nation or a conquering soldier. It did not depend on grand narratives or collective glory. It rooted itself in individual competence, exertion, and visible results. For prisoners, especially the young with long futures ahead, it sketched a way to live after the war, to stand on one's feet in a peaceful society through work. As the end of war shifted from distant concept to looming reality, this new identity, reinforced daily through labor, began to shape how they imagined the future and the choices they felt able to make. Sweat washed away the old stamp of identity, and the approaching peace would offer the first real test of this new understanding. The wire would come down, but some of what formed in labor had already settled into their hands and minds. Then came 1945. The news from the loudspeakers grew more certain. Outside the camp, the world was breaking open. Nazi Germany surrendered. For the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, the announcement did not bring pure relief. It brought a new, far more complicated disorientation. The legal meaning of the wire was fading, but inner bonds and uncertainty about the future became intensely real. The camp atmosphere shifted. Expectation mixed with anxiety, lightness with heaviness. Administrators began the tedious work of registration, screening, and repatriation preparation. Prisoners knew they would soon leave this place, a home they had lived in for months or years, familiar and alien at once. The gates would open, but outside lay two very different roads, each thick with unknown thorns. For the overwhelming majority, the road was clear. Repatriation. They would be grouped and shipped back to the European continent by boat or train. The destination was no longer the homeland of memory, but a Germany divided into occupation zones, shattered, morally bankrupt. Cities were ruins. The economy had collapsed. Food and fuel were desperately scarce. More than that, an entire nation was being forced to face collective guilt. News of the Nuremberg trials, denazification procedures, and occupation troops everywhere created a suffocating low pressure that seemed to sit on everything. These returning prisoners stepped into a landscape of spiritual rubble with the imprint of the camp on them. The changes that began behind the wire, a more critical reception of information, a new suspicion toward extreme propaganda, the experience of earning recognition through work, and perhaps the first awareness of different ways a society could function, would face the harshest tests in raw reality. Under survival pressure and widespread disillusionment, some might retreat into simple nostalgia or new forms of extremism. But many scholars of post-war German transformation argue that a substantial share of former prisoners, especially younger ones, adapted faster than the generation that had never experienced captivity. They tended to be more pragmatic, more wary of collective frenzy, and more capable of accepting the compromise and rule-following required by democratic life. The camps did not hand them answers, but they may have given them a different way to digest trauma and reality. One historian commented, "They were forced, earlier than other Germans, to preview the lessons of defeat and reflection in a relatively isolated setting, even though that preview was full of pain and resistance." Yet a smaller group chose a rarer path, staying. Records and case studies confirm that some former German POWs ultimately remained in Britain, the United States, Canada, or Australia. Their choices were not impulsive. The path often connected directly or indirectly to what they had experienced in captivity. Most commonly, the deciding factor was specialized skill. Engineers, doctors, and technical workers were valuable resources in Allied countries rebuilding and expanding. Some employers or research institutions could apply through formal channels, offering sponsorship and contracts. Another route was trust built during camp labor. A prisoner who performed well might develop a solid working relationship with a farmer who, after the war, might provide employment sponsorship and help him obtain temporary residency. In addition, a deep sense of alienation drove some to stay. For them, returning to a Germany they had fought for and that had committed crimes on a vast scale, felt emotionally and morally unbearable. Camp life, though confinement, had also been a kind of isolation chamber, separating them from destruction and guilt at home. For these men, staying was not only opportunity, it was a deliberate rupture and restart, with the camp serving as a painful, winding new beginning. Whatever the reasons, those who stayed faced major challenges. Language and culture were barriers. The sensitive identity of a former enemy soldier made integration difficult. Their stories rarely became part of mainstream narratives, but their existence carried strong symbolic weight. It marked that the remaking inside the wire could reach beyond the fence, cross the dividing line of war, and shape the most basic question of where a person belongs. This was no longer only a tremor of ideas. It was a migration of fate. Whether they returned to Germany's ruins and struggled to find a place, or quietly began again in a foreign land, these former prisoners were changed in ways that could not be reversed. The years in camp became a special undertone across their later lives. That undertone might be an instinctive doubt toward propaganda, a renewed respect for the value of labor, a wariness of simple answers, or a more complicated understanding of what home means. The intensity differed from person to person, but it existed, and in certain moments in later years it would surface again. When the last prisoners left and the wire was dismantled, the story can seem to close. Yet the altered ideas and life paths, like stones dropped into a still lake, sent ripples that kept spreading. How should we ultimately understand this special experiment, lasting years and involving hundreds of thousands? What, at its core, was it, and what legacy did it leave? When the last prisoners left, when barbed wire was pushed down, guard towers removed, when fields and workshops returned to quiet, the history seems to shut like a book. But the personal stories rewritten in silence were carried outward like seeds, growing in different soils across the post-war world. Now it is time to step back and examine the nature of the process itself. What happened in these POW camps? A successful Americanization, a gentle re-education, or merely an incidental byproduct of the war machine? The answer is likely contained in each of the details we have already traced. It was not a magical brainwashing. There were no mysterious techniques, no sudden mass conversion. Its power came precisely from its ordinary character, its systemic design, and its length. It was a complex symphony performed by environment, information, time, and individual choice. First, it created a safe physical and psychological foundation. Institutionalized, predictable daily management sharply lowered basic survival anxiety. When a person does not have to fear hunger, abuse, or arbitrary execution at every moment, the mind can leave pure defense mode and regain room for more complex activity, including thinking. This was the precondition for everything that followed, a piece of ground leveled so something could be planted. Second, it delivered alternative information and narratives systematically and continuously. Through newspapers, broadcasts, books, and above all visual evidence that could not be argued away, administrators were not simply replacing one propaganda with another, though selection and standpoint were unavoidable. They forced open a window in many prisoners' sealed cognitive worlds, showing another face of the war, another face of their country, and another way to interpret the conflict. That created cognitive dissonance, triggered internal debate, and broke the appearance of perfect unity. Third, it took advantage of natural social evolution. Inside the camp environment, old military authority based on rank gradually weakened, while new influence formed around practical skill, communication ability, and a willingness to serve the group. That shift reinforced the shock that information delivered. When you see a superior who speaks only in doctrine become useless, while a quiet soldier who can fix a radio and bring news earns genuine respect, old assumptions about authority and value become harder to defend. Then, by organizing labor and giving it economic and social meaning, the system provided a solid alternative identity that could be felt with the hands. The identity of soldier gradually faded. The identity of worker or producer strengthened through daily work. Pay vouchers, recognition for skill, limited non-hostile contact with civilian overseers all conveyed a message. Even outside the battlefield and the army, a person can earn dignity and a place through useful, diligent work. It offered a concrete, workable blueprint for life after the war. Finally and crucially, there was time. A change in ideas is rarely a lightning revelation. It requires steady seepage, the settling after arguments, repeated self-questioning inside monotonous days. The camp provided exactly that, a long, forced period of isolation and reflection. The war had not ended, so they could not act. Yet the result was constantly foreshadowed by the flow of information. In that suspended state, time became the most effective catalyst. Running through all of it was individual choice. The environment built a stage, information supplied scripts, time opened the curtain, but the final judge still sat inside each prisoner. Some resisted to the end. Some complied outwardly while despising inwardly. Some wavered. Some began to reflect and change in earnest. The post-war fork in the road, returning to rebuild in trauma or staying abroad to start again, made those differences in choice unmistakable. The camp system did not manufacture a uniform product. It changed the probability distribution of choices. So, more accurately, this was not a one-way shaping or reforming, but an environment that presented different options, interacting with thousands of individuals forced to face those options over time. It did not strip away choice, but it succeeded in making the option of continuing to believe in Nazism and fighting to the end feel increasingly detached from reality and increasingly unsupported within the camp context, while other options, such as living peacefully as a skilled worker, became more concrete and touchable. historians remain cautious in assessing the actual effectiveness of such programs. The general consensus is that outcomes varied widely by camp, by administrators, by prisoner background, and by individual difference. Yet it did happen, and its mechanism, influencing group cognition and behavior through control of environment and information, has been studied deeply, leaving a complicated legacy. Today, in a world of information overload, polarization, and constant efforts to shape what we believe, looking back at this POW camp history can offer lessons that reach beyond its era. It reminds us how sturdy and how fragile the walls of belief can be. Sometimes they are not broken by frontal assault, but by patiently offering the real details of another way to live, by demonstrating different possibilities day after day, and by letting time do its work once basic safety is secured. The barbed wire confined bodies, yet in some cases it also opened a cracked window to a wider world. Change did not arrive in a single moment of conquest. It hid in the small moments of meals, sweat on work crews, the ink on newspapers, and long silences at night. True remaking drew its strength not from what it proclaimed, but from what it demonstrated day after day, quietly, in the ordinary shape of life. And demonstration, in the end, is more powerful than any sermon.